Hey everyone, and welcome to an overview of the absolute mess that was the 16th century. Let's get started. So, the 16th century is sort of marked by the ascension of Henry VII to the Tudor throne in 1485. This is the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, which ends in 1603 with the death of his granddaughter, Elizabeth I. Let's meet the Tudors. So the first dude here was Henry VIII. Sorry, Henry VII. We don't really know much about him. He was just kind of like the beginning. Henry VIII is the guy that we're going to learn a lot about. He was responsible for breaking England away from the Vatican, away from the Catholic Church, and establishing the Church of England, making himself the head. We'll learn more about that in a bit. After that was his son Edward, who was a son of Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour. He was Protestant. After he died, he was sickly, so he died pretty young. His half sister Mary, who was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, which is Henry VIII's first wife, who was also Catholic, ascended the throne, attempted to bring England back to Catholicism, and then after she died, she was succeeded by her half-sister Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn, who was Protestant. So obviously during the Tudor era, there was just upheaval, religious upheaval, upheaval in values, virtues, etc. Let's learn more about that. Again, it was a very dramatic time. Henry VIII sort of kicked off that drama with his infamous breaking from the Catholic Church. He was famous for having six wives. First, Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish princess, and she was devoutly Catholic. He really gets into one of her ladies in waiting, basically, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was young. She was kind of like the resident baddie. Henry VIII wanted her, so he goes to the Pope and he's like, hey, I want to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn instead. Catherine said, hell no. The church said, hell no. And Henry was like, okay, we're not doing this anymore. He creates his own church called the Church of England, names himself the head, and winds up divorcing Catherine, marrying Anne. Not long after, he beheaded Anne for treason, and he proceeded to have four more wives after that, and was succeeded by his last wife, Catherine Parr. She survived him. So lots of drama there. For even more drama, let's look at what happened after the death of Henry VIII. His son Edward, the son of Jane Seymour, he ascended the throne, wanted to turn England fully Protestant, but he died after only 6 years, so he didn't really get that much accomplished. But there was still kind of like this trajectory trying to move towards Protestantism. He was succeeded by his half-sister Mary, who was a devout Catholic. She set out to restore Catholicism throughout England, and she was very bloody, very violent, and she became known as Bloody Mary due to her violent persecution of those who refused her religious demands. Don't say her name 3 times in a mirror. Apparently she appears. After she dies, Elizabeth I became the queen, and she brought England back to Reformation with her Protestant ideology. And she ruled for the rest of the Tudor period. She ruled for a very long time. But what a mess. Let's move forward and talk a little bit about the vibes. So there were a few things going on. There was the Renaissance, which was a period of major social, political, cultural, and economic change. There was the Reformation, which was a period of religious change marked by the spread of Protestantism throughout Europe. There was a rise in literacy prompted by both Protestantism and the expansion of the use of the printing press. And then there was still kind of this like looking back to an idealized past that was very prevalent. So we still see some like pagan influence in the literature of a very Christian era. The vibes. Now let's move on to the Renaissance. So the Renaissance, obviously a big deal. If you don't know what it is, it's a giant Europe-wide movement that emphasized intellect and art over religion. And man, or the human figure, became the sort of central focus here. So we're moving a little bit away from religion, a little bit of spirituality, and more towards human capabilities, intellect, sciences, art, education, literature, culture, politics, and it was majorly inspired by ancient Greek and Roman culture. And it also sparked the beginnings of modern science. What this means in England in particularly is kind of a shift in education, whereas in the past, education was focused more towards theology and for religious purposes, and just because you're privileged. Now, a lot of people are getting educated to prepare for public service and having actual careers, such as lawyers, doctors, scientists, etc. The royal court was an artistic and cultural center, so a lot of arts and cultures were very, like, the court was the locus of that. There were lots of very verbally rich works of literature in English, which were inspired by Greek and Roman Catholics, and there was this, again, continued reverence for an idealized past. The Reformation was another huge deal. So, religious movement that swept through much of Europe. It started with the kind of revival of a previous movement by somebody named Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk. And his whole deal was that he believed that keeping the scripture written in Latin was basically gatekeeping, and we should publish Bibles in English so that individuals can have their own connection with the scripture, their own interpretation and understanding of religion, and it's really kind of making it more of a humble thing. So think of the Catholic Church as gatekeeping. It's fabulous. Cathedrals are full of ornate art and like treasures and paintings and sculptures and stuff like that. And this is really a humbling moment for religion. Some countries were down with it, some countries were not. So this Reformation period basically planted the seeds that eventually became this like widespread Protestant religion. Reformation English in particular kind of took a little bit of hold with Henry VIII because he was so not into the Catholic Church and his strictness, and he really wanted to move towards a new religion. But instead of really committing to Protestantism, he established a Church of England and made himself the head, not wanting to answer to anybody else. And it wasn't till Elizabeth I ascended to the throne and pushed a Protestant agenda after her sister Mary died that England fully kind of like, this is Marlowe, can you get out of the way? That England fully like reverted back into Protestant religion. Something else important that happened with the Reformation was its role in literacy. So the Renaissance highlighted intellectualism and education. The printing press was going strong, and the Reformation as well was one of the main factors responsible for an increase in literacy in general and for women in particular. And a good part of this was because Protestantism emphasized a personal connection with scripture. So a version of the Bible that was written in English was circulated. There's a few other things that we should talk about. First, this is the time when England was starting to explore other countries, other continents. So talking about that, there was an exposure to the New World, which led to a surge in English nationalism as and a stronger sense of Englishness by analyzing not only what an English person is, but by kind of comparing and contrasting themselves with others and articulating what an English person is not. There were also some more foreign immigrants living in England, and they were treated with a sense of fascination, but also with a lot of cruelty. There were riots against foreign artisans because apparently they were taking jobs. What's new, right? I mean, if we think of today, that's how a lot of people are thinking. There's exploitation of labor of African immigrants and a lot of racist depictions of others and otherness in literature. There was also a heightened us versus them mentality that encouraged discrimination or violence against other races and ethnicities. And there was a sense of dehumanization and exoticizing of the foreign lands that they came from in art and literature. So there was definitely that us versus them thing going on. We should talk a little bit about Elizabeth the First, who was kind of sus. So, on the one hand, she was this powerful female ruler under whom arts and literature really flourished. She would refuse to marry and was a strategic, tactical queen who separated her physical female body, known as the body natural, from her God given ruling presence called the body politic, to quash allegations that a single female wouldn't be fit to rule. So girl power. But then she was kind of shady. She outwardly condemned slavery while engaging in it and funding explorers with connections to the slave trade. She outwardly condemned actions of English pirates who raided and pillaged European ships carrying riches from Asia and North America, but she also secretly funded them. And then she engaged in censorship. It was pretty prevalent during the Elizabethan era. And she put to death some publishers who published unapproved written texts. So, sus. And then she was also kind of weird. She made herself into a sort of icon and would dress up in really resplendent attire and appeared almost as a demigod. She just wore tons of jewels and ornate outfits and embroidery and just really, really presented herself as a sort of icon. And she also kind of headed this, what they call like the cult of love, where although she never married and she ruled as a single woman, often being called the Virgin Queen until she died, she engaged in like public flirtations with courtiers and favorite figures in her inner circle. And she kind of required them to praise her and idolize her, both in speech, in writing, and in art. So she kind of had a bit of a like worship fetish or something going on. Let's talk a little bit more about censorship. The printing press allowed more books to be printed and greater circulation of them, but that came with attempts to control what was printed. Anything considered, as your book says, scandalous, malicious, schismatical, and heretical was banned. And some publishers, such as John Penry, Henry Barrow, and John Greenwood, were put to death for publishing pro-Catholic, anti-Protestant content, or any sort of content that wasn't considered appropriate. But it was also kind of disorganized and ineffective. So the scandalous stuff still got around. And something that we learned from studying censorship was that religious texts were often the most popular. They were the ones that made the most money, the ones that people were buying the most. So there was kind of a focus on that. And then we've got the theater. One of the most consumed art forms were plays in the Elizabethan era. Early in the time period, most plays were religious or morality plays, but the Renaissance also saw a rise in plays influenced by Greek and Roman classics, in particular the revenge tragedy, very fun, and the history play, which became popular. There was a surge in building theaters in London in particular, where individual companies would perform the works of single playwrights such as Christopher Marlowe, who I named my cat that you met earlier, after, or William Shakespeare. And playhouses were also supposedly known as sinful places, known for things like crime, theft, prostitution, the spreading of diseases. This is a time where like the plague and stuff was going on. So like you have to be really careful. They were said to promote idleness and sensuality. And even so, they were super popular among people of all social classes. How this is going to impact how we look at the literature. We're going to see a lot of verbal richness, lush language, uses of literary devices, double meanings, description, allusion, symbolism. It's delicious, delicious text. Christopher Marlowe, my boy, introduced the blank verse, which became really, really popular, and it's essentially unrhymed iambic pentameter. Poems that instilled a sense of wonder or idealism were expected to kind of be a model for reality. So we see a lot of these wondrous, delicious, idealized poems that they were like, oh, let's make this real. And then also various poetic forms shaped the language and content and purpose of these poems. So we're going to see lots of different poetic forms. So keep those things in mind as you move through this unit, and I hope you enjoy.